Welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Steel Magnolias. If you can't hum any of the songs, don't worry, there aren't any. Well, actually, there is some radio music in the show. You're seeing a delightful play set in 1987 in Trouvé's in-home beauty salon in Northwest Louisiana. And you're going to meet a group of outrageous women, 6 to be exact, whose ritual, of course, is every week to come to the beauty parlor to be beautified. The motto of the store is, there is no natural beauty. And so these women come every week to be rejuvenated, but much more than that, much more than getting a hairdo. They're there to hear about the gossip, to comment on life in their town. And it's a delightful cavalcade of life in a small town. What's so extraordinary, it's 1987, a group of very sort of isolated women living very, very, very specific lives in a very, very, very small town where issues like the homecoming queen make everyone gasp for a week. But what's so amazing about this show is that it has literally played everywhere in the world. While it is so specifically about particular Southern women at a particular time, it resonates in Japan, it resonates in Italy, it resonates in Ireland. The world seems to relate to these extraordinary women. And of course, it all has to do with the writing of this story. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to look at really two things. Number one, how a writer creates a story for the stage. When we see musicals, we're so bedazzled by production numbers, dance numbers, particular lighting effects, etc., that sometimes we don't realize the complexity and the architecture of how a story is told. So let me begin with Robert Harling. Robert Harling is the playwright, a very, very interesting man. He basically has written one play. Negative people in the theater would refer to him as a playwrote, meaning he only wrote one. But in any case, if you're going to write only one play, make it Steel Magnolias. It has been a gold mine. It has literally touched and dazzled the world. It was turned into a brilliant film. It was turned into a remarkable television film. It had a Broadway version. It's had really an extraordinary life. So Robert Harling, born in 1951 in Alabama. He's definitely a Southern boy. He understands the Southern idiom completely. You'll just smell the Magnolias by the time you leave this production. You'll also smell hairspray, I might add. But nevertheless, it's a very pungent, delightful, touching story that he has created. So his Southern roots are very deep. And in the tradition of Carson McCullers, in the tradition of Tennessee Williams, he's able to make you understand time and place in a very complex way. Just a little history about him first. He went to Tulane Law School, where he passed the bar exam, but he never practiced law. He decided there were no laughs in law, and because he had this incredible sort of offbeat sense of humor, he really sort of felt smothered in the law. So instead, he went off to New York to try and have a career in the theater, actually. His only background prior to that was he had played in a band while he was in school, but he was definitely smitten by theater. And what he would discover, of course, is that he is a brilliant storyteller, very well suited, I might add, for the theater. So in New York, he sold theater tickets, he did commercials, and he found his way into daytime soaps, where he played small roles. He would ultimately create a brilliant movie in a very satiric way about the horrors of daytime soap operas and the divas who work on these programs. He created a brilliant movie called Soap Dish. and it starred Lily Tomlin. It's an extraordinary work. And Robert Downing Jr., Whoopi Goldberg. It's a spectacular film that really, in a very satiric way, shows us the world of soap operas. What we see by this is that he has this penchant for creating worlds that are exaggerated but are exceedingly real at the same time, and he's able to blend humor and serious forms in the same way. Okay, he then would go on to write other major films, the First Wives Club with Bette Midler, and it's a delightful piece again about women who've been rejected for younger, new trophy wives. And again, he creates a world that is so vivid, so idiosyncratic, so correct in terms of time and place. So what we learn about this writer is that, one, he has a wonderful ear for dialogue. So whether he's sort of catching New York matrons or whether he's collecting and recording and defining the idea of the world of soap opera, or whether we're back in Louisiana and we're focusing on these extraordinary women who speak in this lilting Southern accent, he very strongly catches a sense of time and place. So let us look then at Steel Magnolias. This is a story that is really autobiographical. The author, he focuses his story on a mother and daughter. In real life, he's writing about his own mother and sister. And he writes about their lives, their loves, their triumphs, and their tragedies. And he does it in this very extraordinary way. Some things I'd like you to start looking at when you think about the playwright. As we understand, of course, the playwright is the teller of the story. The playwright's obligation is to put a story in a situation that somehow will test everyone and will somehow create a kind of dramatic tension. Always we look for this idea of an arc in a theatrical story. So number one, the playwright, unlike a short story writer, unlike a novelist, is writing in dialogue form. So one of the things I want you to be aware of as you watch Steel Magnolias, first of all, when you walk into the theater, you see this very, very particular environment. It's a ladies' beauty shop in 1987. It's Truvy's in-home beauty salon. Keep in mind, her husband took the carport, redid it, turned it into her deluxe beauty salon, and all the ladies of the neighborhood come and feel pampered and embraced as they pass on their gossip in this wonderful and evocative environment. So take a few minutes when you sit down in the theater to just sort of absorb the set. We literally see, in a one-set show, we see everything we need to know. I mean, this is Truvy's domain. This is where she creates her hair magic. This is where all of the women of the community come to escape their lives, sometimes sad, sometimes disappointed lives, where they can come and feel like they're being treated like queens. So there is a very particular, very evocative environment to this space. You're accustomed to seeing Broadway musicals where you see 18 or 20 different sets and everything is always moving in front of your eyes. And in this case, you're caught in a single environment where the environment will create a very strong atmosphere for you. One of the things that's always interesting to look at when you think about why a playwright picks a particular environment is that the environment has to come alive in front of your eyes. You know many things about this environment. It's an in-home beauty parlor. So therefore, as I told you, it was built in the carport. And you see that it's done on a series of levels. You see the hair dryers. You see all the ritual that makes life come alive in an old beauty parlor like this. As we remember, when we watch this, we're really struck by the idea of how quickly time changes. Right now, if you go to a salon, you're likely to see men, women having all kinds of treatment, from Botox injections to manicures, pedicures, skin cleaning, etc. It becomes literally a total spa where you can have massage and everything. But this is unlike that old-fashioned force, that oasis, where people would go once a week as a weekly ritual to be replenished, to be reborn, and to be beautified. What's fascinating, watch as the story unfolds early on. You make a very strong first impression when you see that physical setting. But then listen very carefully to the dialogue, because what's important is not only establishing the setting that we're in, but what's important is to establish what's going on outside of the setting. And that always becomes very interesting. Not only what we see on stage, but what's happening off stage. And in this case, there are a series of very delightful things. You hear gunshots and all kinds of excitement. You're trying to get into the story, and a gun is going off endlessly, which creates a tremendous amount of early humor. Keep in mind, we love the idea of surprise, the use of the unexpected. So these things happen to give us the sense that this is a safe and quiet place while this mad world is going on outside. Suddenly, then, we will have 6 women coming into this space. And Truve, who, of course, presides over the space, she's the hairdresser, it's her salon, and all of her ladies and cronies come in to be treated like queens. What's so interesting to realize in terms of playwriting, just as in life, in life, if you go to a party and suddenly guests start arriving, we make first impressions. We look at someone and we see how they're dressed. We look at someone and see what their first response is to us. We listen to someone and hear what their first dialogue is to us, whether they're talking about themselves, whether they're talking about you and wanting to know about you. We make very quick first judgments based on what we see. So watch how this works in the show. Again, a good playwright has to immediately establish where we are. The set, of course, helps tremendously with that, and who will be staying in this space, who presides over the space, and who is coming into the space. So watch for this. Very interesting to watch these opening lines of dialogue. This is sometimes the most difficult part of playwriting. What's happening is the playwright is trying to establish character and situation. So as a character comes in, we very quickly have to figure out who they are, what their relationship is to the space, what their relationship is to the outside, and what they do is bring their story to us. This early kind of playwriting is called exposition. And this is very difficult to write. Sometimes exposition can be very forced. In old-fashioned melodramas, for example, the maid would come in and say, "Oh dear," speaking to the head of the house, "the mistress died 2 days ago. I am so sad." Well, everybody knows the mistress died, so this is a kind of forced exposition, and we find it very artificial. Watch in this case how clever the playwright is. Obviously, all of these people are longtime friends. All of these people live in a very small town. All of these people know everything there is to know about one another. And so, we start to see a very different kind of world. So listen very carefully to those opening lines of dialogue. They're very charming, they're very delightful, they're very funny. The characters are all sort of comic types. And we enter into a world of discovering a mother and her daughter, the mayor's widow, the richest and most eccentric old lady in town, a young girl who isn't even sure if she's married or not, who's now starting to work in this world. So she's the stranger, she's the unknown one, she's the one who enters into this known world of everyone else. So it's very interesting to see how a playwright creates what we call the status quo, which is the existing condition. So all of this opening material has to establish very strongly for us 1987, Northwest Louisiana, small town, old friends gathering together. So all of this dialogue will do it. Keep in mind, what's fascinating about what the playwright has to do in this case, he has to write language for the women who all know one another, know one another's history, and we, of course, the audience, are the outsiders, so we have to be able to enter into that world. One of the great gifts this playwright has is he has sort of an immediate sense for comedy. He has a very, very witty sense of humor, and he's able to bring these sort of stereotypic women to life in a very interesting and very colorful way. All of these women, in a way, are kinds of eccentrics, and we enter into their world very quickly. As the storyline progresses early on in the story, in the structure of a playwright tries to build a kind of architecture. So the first obligation, get all the characters in there, get the storyline going, establish the status quo. One of the other things I want you to be very aware of that's very, very difficult to do in plays is this idea of getting a character on stage and getting a character off stage. Remember that in a movie, you can just cut. If you're finished with the scene at the Eiffel Tower, you can cut to the Riviera. And you don't have to worry about how did you get the character in the scene, how do you get the character out of the scene. You just establish the scene, show the character, do the dialogue, and move on. In the case of a musical tends to be very facile also. You get a character in a scene, it happens, you move to the next scene. You don't have to worry in the same way about getting characters on stage and off stage in the way you do in a play. The correct theater term for this is called a French scene. And a French scene means any regrouping of characters. And so watch for that. It's the moment someone new comes in, everything changes. We know this in life, of course. You're talking to your dearest friend, and an acquaintance comes in. Obviously, the tone of the conversation, the atmosphere, the sense of intimacy, everything changes with that entrance. So we don't often have an opportunity to do this, but this is a perfect show to see it. How each entrance happens, how each exit happens, and what happens because of it. And again, very, very clever writing, very skilled in knowing how to do it. Keep in mind, in the theater, we have to build to every entrance and build to every exit. So one of the things I want you to think about as you watch the show, first of all, the show is like a confection. You just sit back, you enter into the world, you laugh at these eccentric people, and you move into their world. You find it delightful, you find it a little frivolous, but you're very happy to enter into that world. But suddenly, things are happening underneath the storyline. And what's going to start to happen is that we're going to realize that we're not just seeing a sort of farcical story about women in a beauty parlor. We're going to see much more than that. We're going to see humans who have the capacity to suffer deeply, and we look into this world, and we keep seeing these characters developed in a more dimensional way. So usually what happens about halfway through the first act of a play is we have what's called the inciting moment. And the inciting moment is the moment when the problem of the play is expressed. We have this beautiful young bride, Shelby. Everything in the early sequence this is her wedding day, and she's there to have her hair done, and she's there to be loved by all her old family friends and her mother, and to be, treated like the princess that she is on her wedding day. And so we enter into this world and we say, isn't this sweet? This is charming. And then all of a sudden something happens in that first act. A problem is presented and we realize the show is really going to be about something else. This is how all good playwriting is always done. We establish a situation, we establish the characters, we present a problem that will totally change the focus of the rest of the show. You'll clearly recognize that the beautiful young girl, Shelby, has a seizure, and we discover that, she's a beautiful young girl on her wedding day, but we also discover that she's a very serious diabetic, and she has a diabetic seizure. And so that will change the whole course of the action of the play. I just want to pause and say that the playwright really based this story on a real-life experience. His sister in real life was diabetic, and the story, I won't spoil the story for you, but the story that you see developed is really substantially the story of his sister's journey. He wrote about it, first of all, as a short story. He then, in a sort of frenzied 10-day period, turned it into a play that would go on, of course, to have phenomenal success. It played for 3 years off Broadway, played on Broadway, played all over the world, as I told you. So suddenly, what's really good about playwriting is that just when you think you understand what the story is about, suddenly the story takes another turn, and you realize there's going to be much more dimension to this story. There's going to be much more empathic connection with this story, and suddenly you're going to see all of the characters tested in a very interesting way. Let me just pause and talk about this. When a playwright writes a play, he always has to find an arc. He has to find a way of presenting a problem, developing the problem, and then resolving the problem. And that will take us through the play. That is the line that draws us through the play. That's what keeps us interested in the story. What's interesting here is he gives us these sort of comic stereotypes. We recognize them right away. We've seen them on situation television. However, what's going to start happening now, once this problem is presented, we're going to see into the characters, and we're going to see them much more dimensionally. So interesting what happens in the arc as we move from the first act to the second act is that our whole perception of these people will change. We won't see them as simple Southern types. We won't see them as stereotypic women. We will start seeing them as dimensional and feeling human beings. And that's when the story takes on another whole power, and we see how skillful the playwright really is in manipulating us through these stories. Another important thing to realize as you move through a play is always about a clash of ideas. And again, we have this group of Southern women, and they're living in a very, very particular society, and unlike ours. And so we have to look into their world. But what we start seeing is even though they have their particular values and beliefs, as we do, suddenly we start seeing that these values and beliefs are going to be tested as we move into this story. One of the things that makes the writer so interesting, once again, is he's able to be funny, always funny. He's able to get the big laughs, always. He has this great skill of understanding one-liners and how to make them really pay off. I mean, if you go back and look at those movies that he did, like Soap Dish, or you go and look at First Wives Club, you see that same ability, those brilliant comic one-liners that really make you laugh. But then he turns it around, and then we get some pathos, we get some drama, and we move more meat, and we start moving more dimensionally into the story. So a playwright always deals then with conflict. He deals with the idea of one person disagreeing with another person. He deals with the idea of one person disagreeing with society. He has the idea of one person struggling within himself. These are all conflicts, man versus man, man versus society, man versus himself. Man versus despair, the idea of this overwhelming negative feeling that we sometimes have in the world. So interesting to watch how all of these conflicts are developed in this story. Many of them done comically. As you move through the story, as we move deep into the second act of the story, and the tensions start really building, and the drama starts intensifying itself, you will find that he uses extraordinary comic devices to break the tension, to make us laugh. Keep in mind, when we think of this kind of arc that exists in a play, we're always working toward the resolution of the story. The problem is presented, the problem is compounded. Shelby is diabetic is the problem. We move through issues of her pregnancy and the results of the pregnancy. As we move through this storyline, we see the story developing and getting more complex and very, very interesting writing in making this happen, but still never losing the comedy and able to keep the humor, although we move into a kind of tearful humor by the end of the story. What's fascinating about this piece is its universality. You know, all plays, in order to be good plays, have to be extremely specific. And, you know, when Ibsen wrote his great dramas, it was Norway in 1890 and Victorian values suppressing the central characters. In this story, you know, it's 1987 in the South. The South is more liberated than it's been before, and the end result is that, you know, we have women relaxing and changing. The play covers a 3-year span, and what's fascinating to see in that 3-year span is not only how the characters change, but how some values change. And I might also add, on a comic level, how hairstyles change. I mean, we move from this enormous sort of bouffant, you can't rat it enough, you can't make it stand up enough, to a much more subdued kind of hairstyle. So what's fascinating is we really get this sense, this cavalcade of time, this passage of time that's wonderfully told in the way the women mellow, in the way the characters change, in the way Shelby matures from a young girl who can only think about loving pink to suddenly having a child that she adores. And we see all of these transformations taking place, and we relate to this. As we have in our own lives. Our own values have changed. I mean, we go back and look in our photo albums of the haircuts we had in the 60s, 70s, however far back you can go, and the end result is, you know, you see an immediate change in that visual look. And so the show gives us all of this, and it develops it in a very sweet way. You know, Laura Kepley, the artistic director of the show, is also the artistic director of the Cleveland Playhouse. And she understands how to work with women. And she's created women who are, one, funny, outrageous, over the top, but they're also exceedingly believable. And what she has done in this development, in her work as a director, it's like she's taken an onion and she keeps peeling away layers till we go further and further into the character and begin to understand who these people are. So it's done in a very sensitive way, in a very comedic way, and I think you're going to have a really good time. You don't have to take your own hairspray. They provide enough for the entire audience. So please enjoy the Steel Magnolias. Thank you.